Welcome to the Omnibus Show, a program for people who are interested in everything, conversations on a wide variety of subjects. And now your host, Dave Gibbs.
That will go very well. Okay. Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Omnibus Show, the program for people who are interested in everything, with deep conversations on a wide variety of subjects. This week's guest is Aaron Renn. He's co-founder and senior fellow at American Reformer. He also writes on cultural topics at aaronrenn.substack.com. Renn has worked as an urban policy researcher, writer, and consultant. He was a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research for 5 years. His work has been featured in leading publications such as the New York Times, The Guardian, and The Atlantic, among others. Aaron, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you here. You've done a lot of work on cultural topics. Would you please take us through your journey in public matters?
Well, I've really had 3 separate careers. After I graduated from school, I first moved to Chicago and worked in management consulting. So I was with a company called Accenture for a very long time, one of the world's largest professional services firms. I did that for about 15 years, helping companies adapt to changing technology and business landscapes. And then I got interested in urban policy and cities. And I'd grown up in a rural area. I grew up 4 miles outside of a town of 50 people. And I created a blog about cities called the Urbanophile, the lover of cities. Someone once said, Aaron, you love cities like only someone from a town of 50 people or so can. What I saw was that all the discussions about what cities should be were coming off of the coast. It was places like New York, or it was Portland, Oregon. But the Midwest was sort of overlooked. I was a Midwestern guy, grew up in southern Indiana, and was living in Chicago. I just felt like we do not get people writing about cities, writing about the cultures of places from the standpoint of where we're at. We need to have indigenous thinking, indigenous R&D. So I started a blog to sort of write about the topic because I thought I had something to say, and it got really popular.
It did.
And
I used to read it frequently, all the time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I ended up winning an international competition for ideas on how to boost public transit ridership in Chicago. One of my readers said, Aaron, the Chicagoland Chamber of Commerce is sponsoring this. You should enter it. So I entered it and ended up winning. And because they had a great PR department at the Chicagoland Chamber, ended up with my picture on the cover of the Chicago Tribune above the fold.
That's awesome.
I like to say I'm so glad I got my picture in the paper while there's still a paper to get your picture in.
Yeah. I love that.
But people would start calling me, media people, or even government officials, asking me things. I'm like, man, maybe there's another career here. And so I ended up leaving Accenture to try to professionalize that. And it took a while to figure it out, but ended up at a think tank in New York City, where I still mostly focused on the Midwest.
Yes.
And so I had this whole second career talking about places and how can we help some of these overlooked places in America to thrive again. And this was something that, of course, really exploded in the public consciousness after the 2016 election. And then about a decade ago, I got interested in a third topic. It really started out looking at men's issues because I saw, men are sort of checked out of churches, they're checked out of the traditional institutions of society, but yet there are all these sort of online influencers who are starting to attract thousands of young men. At the time, it was tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands.
Yes.
And why are they turning to these guys? And so I started writing about those issues.
The manosphere.
The manosphere.
Type.
I started writing in that. Of course, today, everyone's heard of Jordan Peterson, Joe Rogan, or the infamous Andrew Tate, who's reached something like 80% of all teenage boys. So I got very interested in that, and particularly from the standpoint of how can churches really reach men. And so I sort of became someone who was been known for sort of cultural analysis in the present day, sort of from a religious lens. But that's basically what I do today, although I still do all of the other things that I did before on urban policy and some consulting as well.
That's fascinating because that's why I kept it kind of open-ended, because you've had such a wide experience. And I find it very fascinating I was a regular reader on Umbranophile, and to kind of dovetail or 6 degrees of separation. When I started out as a photographer, when I was in college, I actually started my shadowing. I was a shadow/assistant with photographers from the Chicago Tribune, so we have that relationship tied in. But that's really, really fascinating that you've taken that path, because I think you have a perspective that, from what I've read, has a lot to offer a lot of people and who are interested, from everything from urban development and so forth to men's issues. And I think we can follow you on that and see how things are going on urban policy. And I always add all three: the suburbs and the rural communities. What would you say are key factors in a community renewal, or however you would want to phrase that term?
Well, a lot of what I studied was the Midwest. This is the area they called the Rust Belt.
Sure.
It's places that by and large had gone into decline.
Yeah.
And some of them, like Chicago, sort of came back. They had something of a comeback. So in 1981, the Chicago Tribune did a 4-part front page series called A City on the Brink that basically argued Chicago is going down the tubes and there's basically no way to save it. Well, Chicago came back. And yes, they've got huge problems. Let's not minimize the problems there. But like New York and like some of the other big cities, Chicago came back. But this is a region that was characterized by pervasive decline. Most places didn't come back. And I've heard all the theories about how cities come back. One of them is we need to cut taxes. So there's the whole tax cut theory, cut regulation, be more business friendly, be like Texas with no income tax. That'll draw people. And I've heard that, well, we need to invest in education, or we need to invest in public places, or we need to subsidize knowledge clusters. There are all of these theories out there.
Yes.
And what I have come to the conclusion is all of them have worked in some places. All of them have failed in other places. And really, if you look at the Midwest, or the area that I call the Old North, which are the 23 states in the Great Plains, the Midwest, and the Northeast.
Sure.
Basically, none of them are doing all that great, regardless of policy. If you look at the places that are doing great, they tend to be in the West, and they tend to be in the South, Southwest. Yeah. And so I think a lot of times there's not a lot we can do. I hate to say that. And there has to be sort of the has to be times that are right for renewal. You know, cities came back in the 90s, and everybody credited the super mayors like Giuliani or Richard Daley and all these different ones. And they were all good in their own way, but the reality is cities were just coming back.
Yeah.
Now we see that, the Youngstown didn't come back, Flint didn't come back. And I don't know if there's a public policy solution to some of these problems. If you look at it, you say Indiana is a red state, Illinois is a blue state. They look very similar in terms of they're kind of stagnant demographically and economically. Again, New Hampshire, the live free or die, libertarian paradise versus socialist Vermont, they look an awful lot alike.
Yes.
So you say big states, small states, red states, blue states, urban states, rural states, all of these have kind of done relatively the same. Some better here, some better there. And the number one predictor of population growth since 1960 has basically been your average temperature in January. And so sometimes external factors count for a lot, I'm afraid to say. And so what I argue is, if you have a community, don't think you could make it prosperous just by sort of taking action. But I say try to make it a better place to live for the people who are already there. Sure. Focus on the people who live there and say, how can you make their lives better? And you do that basically through high-quality public goods and services. Let's have our streets paved. Let's remediate the brownfields. Let's have nice parks, things of that nature. Yeah. Let's fix up our downtown. Let's have things that are good for us, that make our lives better. And if other people want to take advantage of it, so much the better.
Yeah. Well, that's very good, because I think Indianapolis has moved strides from where it was, say, in the 1970s. And Carmel was originally primarily a Quaker farm town that developed. It's really developed during Mayor Brainerd's term since the 90s. It's just grown leaps and bounds. I think the town has gone from the 20,000 mark to we're about 100,000 now here in Carmel. So that's fascinating. Well, taking it to the other side of your writing and study, how would you say key factors in men's renewal? What would be something more constructive that would be that differentiates? Because you're different. While you're interested in men, you're very different from that manosphere crowd.
Well, what I say is we have to be honest about the facts that men and women are different. Mm-hmm. You can see this in the psychology literature where they differ on things like the big 5 personality traits. Jordan Peterson's a psychologist, and one of the things that made him famous was his appearance on the UK's Channel 4, where he had a very hostile female interviewer, and he said things like, well, women are higher in agreeableness than men are. And that's true. And so I think we need to have the courage to just talk about the ways that men and women are distinct so that they can flourish in who they are.
Sure.
Not because one's better than the other.
Right.
But because there's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all model for the gender. So I think there's been a sort of denial of human nature, a denial of reality there. So that's one. And then I think men, one of the things that came out of the manosphere that's actually good was the ethos of self-improvement. And what they will say is, why don't you focus on getting in better shape, upgrading your style, learning how to be more confident in social interactions, learn how to become an entrepreneur and get better in business. And so all those things are good for you and then good for those around you. I think a lot of times people, like a lot of the churches and other people, they like to tell men to man up. You just need to do your duty to society. Serve your wife and kids, go to get a job and go to work every day. And there's some of that's true, but people forgot about men themselves. Sure. And so helping yourself flourish in terms of health and those things are a prerequisite before you can do things for other people. Yeah. And so because you can't give somebody something you don't have yourself. And so I think this idea of helping people to achieve those things is something that I would look at. First, let's help them get healthy, and then look beyond themselves to society and family.
Yeah, that's a much healthier perspective from the dividing perspectives. That's very that's a lot to think about because there's so many divisions today, and I think that what are positive strides, and you're certainly suggesting reflection that would be constructive. And I think that's helpful. Well, to circle back around on urban things, I wanted to finish this chapter on architecture, which I've read your writings before on, and I like your perspective. In your words, how does architecture affect us and impact our society?
Well, there's this famous saying, we shape our buildings and then they shape us. I really like architecture of different varieties. I like classical and traditional architecture. I also like a lot of contemporary architecture as well, modern architecture. Yeah, I think a lot of people really don't care about architecture all that much. The famous curmudgeon H.L. Mencken once wrote an essay called The Libido for the Ugly when he was talking about Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, outside of Pittsburgh. He was like, this thing is so ugly, and they like it that way. And so I think there's always been the temptation for something of an elitist mindset when it comes to architecture and sort of blaming the sprawl, the generic sprawl of our country for making it look bad. And I would like to elevate the public realm in terms of making architecture better. I think it makes a statement about things, but we shouldn't make that too much of the number one thing. What I would just say, and this comes back to like creating better communities as well, is that if you're trying to attract people to your community, if you're trying to attract in particular high talent people, that startup founder, that chief surgeon type person, the CEO, they want to have public amenities that match their private amenities. if you have a multi-million-dollar home and all of that, you don't want to live in a junky community. You want to live in a nice community.
Correct.
And so the architecture of the public realm, I think, goes along with setting a tone for the aspiration of the kind of place you want to be.
Yeah, I think that's a very thoughtful and critical, in a good way to look at the community. And that's getting towards my interest in your thoughts on urban and suburban and rural, because this can apply to the rural communities as well, renewal. So that's very thoughtful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we're going to take a little break right now, and when we return, we will go into Chapter 2. Welcome back. Today we're speaking with Aaron Renn on social policy, and we're now in Chapter 2. Aaron, in regard to today's divisions, we touched on it a little bit before. What would you say is possible for positive social dynamics? You know, something that's a positive. I don't want to say the third way, as that's been used before, but things that would be a positive social dynamic from what you've written, what you've observed.
So you're basically asking me to solve world peace.
I am.
It's a very
That's what
difficult
we all
question.
want.
I think we need to recognize that some of the divisions in our society are not a result of just partisanship or style, but really reflect fundamental disagreements about the nature of the good life and the good society that simply can't be reconciled through compromise. So, for example, right here in Carmel, Indiana, some people really want to embrace a more forward-looking vision of like all these roundabouts that we've built
Yes.
in our traffic intersections, or a more high-density, mixed-use, urban-style development, new parks, nice parks. Other people want the community to remain the way it was, 20 years ago. They don't like this. They don't want it. They're like, I moved here to get away from that stuff. And it's really hard to find a compromise position between people who want a very different kind of future from each other.
Yeah.
And so I think we need to recognize these people are not necessarily going to get along. So what I just suggest to people in general is not to spend too much time on Twitter, not to spend too much time in politics, to find your identity in politics, but to, focus on life. And if we don't read the newspapers and we stay off social media and we just go about our lives with our family, maybe visit the library in our neighborhood, talk with our neighbors without bringing that stuff up, it's like, wow, America can still be pretty good. And that's not true everywhere. There are lots of places that are very bleak, and I don't want to overlook that. But I think sometimes we take this and we turn it into some sort of an existential crisis, when in fact, especially in the local matters and other things, we can just dial back the amount of exposure that we have so we don't give ourselves cortisol spikes, get ourselves unhealthy, have heart attacks, that sort of thing. So I think we do need to recognize that some of these divides are fundamental and over substance. They're not just sort of cosmetic. In fact, when they were more cosmetic, when political parties were sort of just constellations of different groups that competed for power, it was more like a basketball game, one wins, one loses, and then we could all, go have a drink together or something. It's a lot harder to do that when there are groups of people that really are aligned around completely different views of society. So that probably not an easy way to reconcile that, but we can at least allow it not to harm us too much. And we can try to engage with people on the things that are maybe more practical at the local level that cut against some of these national divisions and say, how can we find things to talk to people about that don't involve these divisions all the time and not make them the center of attention all the time? I guess that's the best that I could say.
No, I think that's very thoughtful because we're certainly in a very divisive time, and being constructive, and especially locally constructive, whether you live in Carmel or whether you live in a town like Seattle or Los Alamos, we can all, just be ourselves locally. Thank you very much for that. I know that's really a tough question. That was...
You said you were going to ask tough questions. You did.
Yeah, there you go. Now in a more personal way, because I like to focus on those people who can learn from you personally. If an individual, thinking someone who's like a student, who's coming up through work, maybe they're getting their first job and they're with a consultant agency and so forth, and they want to write and speak on matters of urban policy and reform, what path would you suggest for effectively making a difference for them? Like, I know everybody's going to be individual, but just some thoughtful points of how they should develop their writing skills and their consultancy, and you know what I mean?
Right.
Beyond the MBA.
What I would say is when I was working primarily in urban policy, people used to ask me two questions above all else. Number one is, what is it that you actually do? And the other question is, how can I do what you do? And there was this sense that people really wanted to essentially be a journalist writing about different places. Mm-hmm. And I always tell people, you don't want to do what I do, because I'm essentially in the creator economy or the influencer economy. I don't like to think of myself that way, just as I don't think of myself as a journalist either, although I sort of am. I still think of myself at heart as a consultant in what I do.
Sure.
The challenge with trying to go the route that I've gone in terms of being a public voice is that success in these things follows a power law distribution. So there are a handful of very famous people who make a ton of money and sell a ton of books. Then there's a slightly larger set of group of people who make a living, and then everybody else basically can't make any money off of it. Mm-hmm. And so it's like that, when you're trying to create your own music, it's like that in acting. It's like that in sort of any creator economy type field. Mm-hmm. Today, fewer and fewer people are sort of the superstars and are able to make a living at it. So you're going into something that's incredibly competitive. And secondly, in order to basically attract an audience for things in what I do, you sort of have to cut against the grain a little bit and say things that are a little bit outside the norm. Most people aren't wired for that. Yeah. And then secondly, when you start doing that, it's sort of, even people who like you sort of view you as, a little bit of a rogue operator. And so that sort of path is very, very difficult. Mm-hmm. If you have a unique talent and a unique personality and you get some luck, you can do it. The way I think that most people operate is the inside game, where you go and get a degree in, say, urban planning, work for a city, or end up being a consultant on some projects. Maybe you become a transportation planner. Maybe you work for an engineering firm, and then you work essentially inside the system. Mm-hmm. It's not as fun sometimes as it is to just give your opinion on things, but it's definitely a much more stable career, and acquiring some credentials can definitely help you. And what those credentials look like are going to vary. Mm-hmm. If you get a PhD in economics, like, say, Ed Glazer or Richard Florida, two of the most famous commentators in this space, that's good. Again, a master's in urban planning, some type of an architecture degree, something to get you a credential that gives you a certain technical authority in what you say. I don't have those because I come from a management consulting background where we're not technicians in a particular niche field. Yes. We're looking holistically integratively across all the things at a high level. But I think that's probably a safer career bet to go kind of the inside game. But for some people, just like some people want to become actors, some people really want to sort of be a more public voice. But I always tell people, do not underestimate how difficult that is. I was very naive after getting my picture on the cover of the paper and having people call me. I'm like, oh, this is going to be easy. It's actually incredibly difficult to make that transition, and it easily could have been a failure for me.
Sure.
And I was pretty good at what I was doing, and so just don't underestimate the difficulties of going. They call it anything that's like a creator economy route.
Yeah.
It's sort of like starting a business, exhilarating, you can hit it big, but also extremely high risk of failure.
Very high risk of failure, but very exciting, and you're able to make a difference.
I think
Certainly.
so.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Thanks for sharing your thoughts on that. And now, as we're moving on, what are you working on now that you would like to tell us about?
I like to look at the areas where I see that there's a need or there's something going on, but other people aren't looking at it. And it's a space that kind of needs to be disrupted. Sort of did that with the city space. Nobody's paying attention to the Rust Belt. Nobody's paying attention to the Midwest. Everybody's just promoting what I call a school solution: cut taxes, spend more on education. I said this space needs to be disrupted. I sort of did the same thing on men's issues. Right now, one that I'm doing is a project on the future of Appalachia. There's another sort of region that it has been studied to death. I don't want to claim that no one has studied Appalachia. Obviously, J.D. Vance had a best-selling book, the memoir Hillbilly Elegy, talking about his Appalachian family. But I'm looking at the ways that remote work potentially offers possibilities for Appalachia, both in terms of attracting people and in terms of connecting people who are there to jobs. So the opportunities and risks that come with that. And again, as I said earlier, the idea that remote work is going to just resurrect Appalachia, I don't want to make that claim.
Sure.
But I'm hoping on the margins and for individuals that this is going to be something that allows us to move in the correct direction. And maybe it is one of those structural factors that helps give it a little bit of a lift. So that's what I'm working on right now.
Sure. Well, thank you. And best wishes on that.
Thanks.
Thank you. Well, thank you for being with us today. We look forward to our next episode and with you to be with us on the Omnibus Show.
If you enjoyed this program, please like, share, and subscribe to continue the conversation. For the Omnibus Show newsletter, please sign up at theomnibusshow.com.